Let's get to the point. A super violent anime with Vikings fighting to the death at the edge of their swords, ships, adventures, and beautiful fantasy landscapes that also has a grim story from beginning to end where a strong feeling of revenge prevails, or not. Created by animation studio WIT, this is the Vinland Saga. We find ourselves in Iceland, more precisely in the house of a little boy called Thorfinn, who alongside some other kids from his village is listening to the stories told by an old man named Leif Erikson about an incredible place known as Vinland. Here we see that Thorfinn lives in a cabin with his mother Helga, his father Thors, and his sister Ylva. One day, Leif tells Thorfinn, who was asking why they lived in such a desolate and cold and dangerous place, that his ancestors fled from Norway to escape from a tyrant called Harald, who destroyed everything. Thorfinn, who refused to believe his ancestors were such cowards, ran back home and found his father trying to warm a slave that his sister found buried under the snow a few moments ago. Halfdan, the slave's owner, arrives at the scene causing a ruckus, and when he finds his slave on the brink of death, Thors offers to buy him for a cheap price of 8 sheep, even though the slave died minutes later. While Thorfinn plays at pretending to be a warrior, he sees a warship approaching his village in search of his father. Floki disembarks from it, an old crewmate of Thors, who reveals that before arriving in Iceland, Thors was a warrior that killed a lot of people, and also Floki warns that a war is about to break out against England because the sister of the king of Denmark passed away, and he needs Thor's help, who at first denies the offer due to having abandoned his old life, but because the entire town is in danger, he has no choice but to accept. Despite being about to go to war, Thors notices that Thorfinn is looking for a sword and wishes to be a warrior, so he gives him an important lesson. You have no enemies. Nobody has enemies. Nobody in the world deserves to be heard. Then, while Floki speaks to a guy called Askeladd, it is revealed to us that this is just a trap to kill Thors. When they set sail, Thorfinn is not present to say goodbye to his father, and once they put to sea, pushed forward by the currents, he comes out of a barrel where he's hiding with the intention of following his father to war, and when they arrive at their first stop, they realize they could be ambushed, but it's too late, and the way back is cut off. And so Thors gives his son a sword, and alone he jumps on Askeladd's ship, taking down several enemies with one strike. After defeating half the crew by himself, Thors returns to the ship and challenges Askeladd to a duel. After a fierce and epic battle, even though Thors was victorious, Askeladd decides to break the rules of the duel, and in that moment, one of his men captures Thorfinn and threatens to kill him, forcing Thors to sacrifice his own life to save him and his village. And here is where the great Thors dies, leaving us with a last lesson. A true warrior does not use weapons. After seeing his father die in front of him and consumed by rage, frustration, and vengeance, Thorfinn hides in the ship that Askeladd captured, and right there he screams and swears that he will kill them all. When Askeladd's crew arrives at a nearby town and kills all of its inhabitants, Thorfinn, with barely any strength left, finds some water to keep moving forward, and when the night falls, he locates the cabin where Askeladd is resting, and comes inside with his sword to take revenge, but the pride he inherited from his father does not allow him to kill him while he sleeps, even though he was actually awake. And when the sun rises, Thorfinn challenges Askeladd to a duel, who humiliates him and defeats him easily. When he wakes up, Askeladd's men offer him a small bone and some meat on it, but Thorfinn obviously refuses to eat it and decides to look for food by himself. Meanwhile, Leif tells Helga and Ylva that Thors is dead and that Thorfinn has disappeared, although the latter is indifferent to it and goes back to work, acting as if nothing happened. But when the night falls and she's tired, her mother asks her to stop and take a rest, and that's when she inevitably bursts into tears. Thorfinn continues training alone in the forest and improving little by little, although he loses another duel against Askeladd before leaving, and he promises Thorfinn that if he proves himself in battle, they will duel again. Now, in Askeladd's crew, Hora en la Tripulación de Askeladd, Thorfinn participates in real battles and takes advantage of every situation to become stronger so that he might fight another duel and win. He grows and learns, becoming braver and fiercer until one day, after infiltrating a town in England, Thorfinn passes out and is helped by a lady and her daughter, who gives him clothes and food, and despite being warned that there was a Viking spy around the boy's age, she decides to hide him because he reminded her of his dead son. Thanks to this, Thorfinn Thorfinn takes pity on them and tries to tell them, since he doesn't speak English, to run away since his fellow pirates were on the way. But when they arrived, the woman was still there, and with tears in her eyes, she witnessed how Thorfinn killed English soldiers, and when he sees her, he remembers his mother and sister before joining the pirates once again. The years pass, and they stop their incursions into England for a while to rest and prepare for a great attack. While Askeladd's men look for lands where there is food for everyone, they come across a battle in France, which they decide to take advantage of, but not before Thorfinn reminds him of his promise. And when he gets the enemy general's head, they will have another duel. And so, during the attack, Thorfinn climbs to the wall where the general was located, and right when the enemy was about to ask Askeladd and his men with crossbows, Thorfinn appears behind him and begins to cut them down one by one until he gets to their commander and takes his head. From the water, Thorfinn gets on the ship while holding the head and finally challenges Askeladd to a duel, although it must wait because they first need to escape. After arriving in Askeladd's village, now safe, and with a great amount of loot, Thorfinn finally faces Askeladd in a duel, who, seeing how much Thorfinn improved physically, decides to test him mentally, taunting him while forcing him to remember how his father died, which makes Thorfinn lose control and flail blindly due to Rantzor. Askeladd takes advantage of this by grabbing his arm and dislocating his shoulder, defeating Thorfinn once again. At nighttime, while Thorfinn was taking care of the ship, he met his father in a dream, who was once again trying to explain to him that he doesn't need to take revenge, but that is something he needs to learn on his own. Suddenly, he's awoken by one of the town's slaves, a girl called Hordaland, who is the daughter of a feudal lord. She was tasked with bringing food to Thorfinn, who tells her of a land without slaves called Vinland. During this year, Danish Vikings advance, conquering and razing every place they come across until they arrive at London, while everyone gets ready to conquer the city. But one of the strongest Norsemen, a man called Thorkel, is on the side of the English, just because he enjoys harder battles. As usual, Askeladd orders Thorfinn to get his head in exchange for another duel, a duel that Thorfinn swears will be the last one. And so, once again, Thorfinn goes direct after Thorkel, and they begin fighting. Thorfinn manages to cut his wrist, but this time his rival is too strong, and after trying to stab his neck, Thorkel stops him with his hand and proceeds to beat him again against the wooden walls of the fortress, and for the first time we see that Thorfinn fails in his objective. Askeladd decides to retreat, leaving Thorfinn for dead, but the latter is still conscious and cuts off Thorkel's fingers, which surprises him and asks for his name. Thorfinn introduces himself as the son of Thors, which amazes the large warrior, and then manages to escape to regroup with Askeladd's men. While they are resting in a faraway town, Askeladd is informed that Thorkel had kidnapped Prince Canute of Denmark, who commanded one of the squadrons assigned by the king to stop his soldiers from surrendering and continue fighting in the war. So, with the idea that Ragnarok is coming, he decides to save the prince to obtain great riches, even though fighting Thorkel's men might mean death. While Thorkel was taking the prince hostage, he was intercepted by one of the king's squadrons, demanding that the prisoners be freed. Thorkel has no problem with freeing them, just so that he may fight. And in the middle of the battle, Askeladd and his men set the forest on fire so that they can take the prince away. Obviously, the one in charge of saving him is Thorfinn, and once again meets with Thorkel, who asked him about what he said earlier about being the son of Thors, and then reveals that he knew him and his wife, because Thors was the only man stronger than him, making Thorfinn feel a little confused. Later, Thorkel lets him take the prince, confident because he already knows they are headed to the same place, and they will fight again. Once Askeladd talks to Ragnar, who is the prince's tutor, and decides that they will be their bodyguards, they ask the prince to take off his helmet and see his face, and they are all surprised because of his very feminine appearance. While Askeladd's men advance with the prince, his advisor and priest, Thorkel follows them, so Askeladd calls for reinforcements from Wales in order to not be reached by him. But while they are entering the country by foot, they are ambushed by the Welsh. Meanwhile, we see an already old Leif, who notices a small prisoner that looks similar to Thorfinn. In indicating that he's either still looking for him or that he feels guilty because he didn't find him and bring him back home. To avoid conflict with the Welsh, Askeladd asks the prince to say something as a show of authority and confidence, but Canute freezes in place and hides behind his advisor. In order to make the Welsh trust that they won't cause any trouble, Askeladd goes to negotiate with the messenger that prepared the ambush. We see Askeladd acting very differently, being calm and respectful, and we also find out something very interesting. Turns out Askeladd is part Danish from his father's side, while his mother was a Welsh nobleman, which means that he's a descendant of Artorius, a legendary commander and historical figure on whom the tale of King Arthur was based on. Also, Askeladd confesses that he actually despises the Danes. Thanks to Askeladd's ancestry, they decide to trust him and his plan of making Canute the king of Denmark, and to get a good position so that the Danes never set foot in Wales. And while they are taken away as if they were prisoners, Canute glances constantly at Thorfinn, who is beside him, and so the latter begins to taunt him, and they begin to argue, this being the first time Canute talks with someone that isn't his advisor. Under a heavy snowstorm, Askeladd and his men pillage a nearby village to get food and supplies. After looting everything, they kill all the civilians as is custom, without realizing that a girl named Anne was hiding and survived. Due to this, she arrives to where Thorkel is located, who learns of the Danes' attack and is confident that it was Askeladd's doing, so he decides to go recover Canute as a prisoner and prolong the war. After learning that the English already know of his whereabouts, Askeladd orders his men to advance, but not before getting rid of Ragnar, the prince's advisor, to usurp his position. Before dying, he tells them that the prince's lineage is divided, since one part supports Canute and the other his older brother Harold, and he warns them that the biggest threat to the prince is his own father, who, according to him, sent him to war so that he would die in battle. However, in certain occasions, we can see that the king actually worries for Canute, and we hear him telling Floki that he's a very precious person to him. With Thorkel closing the distance and Askeladd aware of this, they decide to advance as fast as possible. Due to a streak of bad luck, Askeladd's men start to doubt him and stop seeing him as a good leader. And right when Thorkel is about to catch up to them, many men betray Askeladd and attempt to take the prince and bring him to Thorkel and join his 500-man strong army. Askeladd sends his right-hand man, Bjorn, and Thorfinn with the prince so that he may escape, but the traitors reach them and the prince falls to the ground. Thorfinn uses this chance to go back to Askeladd, hoping that he's still alive, and when he arrives, he sees that Askeladd is on his knees after fighting against the traitors, and with Thorkel standing next to him, who ordered to kill everyone except Askeladd. And so Thorfinn rushes to the scene with his horse, and Thorkel challenges him to a duel. To make sure Askeladd survives, Thorfinn faces Thorkel, and even though it seems Thorfinn is slightly better, Thorkel isn't impressed and once again mentioned his father and tells him that if he wants to hear all he knows about his father, he must keep fighting. After a long battle, Thorfinn is sent flying with a kick and falls to the ground. Meanwhile, Bjorn continues fighting in a maddened state to protect the prince, and Canute, after having a conversation with the priest, finally understands the meaning of love and his mission in the world. With this, he feels the determination of a king for the first time. Thorkel goes to the place where Thorfinn landed, and when he gets up, his arm goes limp since it's completely broken. And while Askeladd helps him, Thorkel, who we now learn is Thorfinn's great uncle, tells him how Thor's escaped alongside Helga to live with his family, and Thorkel refused to let him go. But after looking at his eyes and getting knocked out by Thor's, he never saw him again. After this, Thorkel and Thorfinn continue fighting, despite the fact that the latter could only use one arm. But thanks to Askeladd, Thorfinn manages to win the duel, and then Thorkel's men were about to kill him. Canute arrives, and with great calm and maturity orders them to stop fighting and head to Denmark to depose the king. After learning that Canute's life wouldn't serve them as they thought, and remembering Thor's look in his eyes, Thorkel decides to put everything aside and serve as his underlining, just like Askeladd, who, seeing the way the prince changed, confesses that he was the one who killed Ragnar. Canute forgives him and also takes him in as a servant taking the place of his advisor, and so, forgetting their dispute, they all accompany the prince. After arriving at the castle, Canute, Thorfinn, and Askeladd appear before the king, and right after crossing the gate, they realize that there are men with hidden weapons everywhere. The king can already guess what the prince is planning just by looking at his eyes, so he sets up a trap right there and forces him to leave in silence to go live in a peaceful life and let his older brother inherit the throne. But thanks to Askeladd's words, the king relents and agrees to reward his son for what he's achieved by giving him a banquet, and so they spend the night resting and planning their next move. After arriving at a large city called York, which was controlled by the Danish, Askeladd orchestrates a false attack against the prince, this being part of the plan of spreading rumors that the king is trying to kill him. To do this, they use a female slave and make her get shot with a crossbow. Thorfinn then kills the traitor, and in the docks he comes across none other than Leif, who, with tears in his eyes, hugs him and is glad he's alive. Thorfinn tells him that his only goal is to kill Askeladd in a duel, and rejects Leif's request to go back home. After following Ragnar's brother, who was a spy of the king among them, Thorfinn once again challenges Askeladd to a duel at dawn. The latter is delayed, since he first needs to fight with Bjorn, who, due to the battle with the traitors, is expecting an imminent death. And so, after Askeladd confesses that he was his only friend, he ends his life in battle so that he may have a place in Valhalla. As soon as Thorfinn begins his duel with Askeladd, he receives a terrible beating, the worst one so far, and Askeladd knocks him out, and tired of always seeing the same results, he tells Canute and Thorfinn how he grew up taking care of his mother, who always told him how his ancestor, Artorius, was recovering from his battles in a fantasy land. He also hated his father, an ordinary Viking that only recognized him when he saw his skill with his sword, and after 2 years of gaining his trust, he killed him while he slept and blamed his older brother, and now we can see where his hatred of Vikings that fight without thinking comes from. Later that day, Canute, alongside Thorkel and Askeladd, have a banquet with the king where the ones that arrive safely with the king would be rewarded with riches and lands. And he even grants his son Canute the most prosperous land in his possession to clean up any suspicions that he wanted to kill him, something Askeladd already expected, but to his misfortune, he also announces an attack against Wales in spring, something that really worries Askeladd because, as we saw before, he really loves his country. While all of this was happening, the still wounded Thorfinn was arrested after hitting a few civilians and leaving them unconscious. He's visited by Leif, who once again tells him of Vinland, and tells him that if his fater was still alive, he would look for the way there, offering to go together and live in peace in that land without slavery or war. Thorfinn accompanies Leif to his ships, but has a feeling that something is wrong, so he goes to where Askeladd and the prince are. Because the king forced Askeladd to choose between Wales or the prince, offering him to leave the country in peace in exchange for his son's head, Askeladd decides to act in between insults, points his sword at the king, and beheads him. Canute, seeing all of this, realizes that he must seize the chance that Askeladd is giving him to take command and save Wales, and orders everyone to kill him. Askeladd, in a false state of insanity, begins to kill everyone, shouting that he's the true king of England and that his name is Artorius. Thorfinn sees this and intervenes, trying to get Askeladd out of there so he doesn't get killed, but Canute stabs Askeladd in the heart with his sword. Now, dying on the floor and with Thorfinn yelling at him to get up, Askeladd asks him what he's going to do next, and asks him to become a true warrior just like his father and move far away. In desperation, Thorfinn yells at him to get up and fight, but Askeladd finally dies. A completely enraged Thorfinn attacks the prince for having taken the life of the man he wanted to take revenge on for his father's death, managing to slice his face, but is then stopped by Thorkel. At Canute's request, Thorfinn is taken away, and the former takes advantage of the situation by proclaiming himself the new king of Denmark and abandoning the attack on Wales. Desperate and without control, Thorfinn looks at Askeladd's lifeless body lying on the floor and drops his father's dagger, which reflects our protagonist's past, finally ending this first season. The last episodes leaves us with a few short scenes as a form of a preview of what the second season of Vinland Saga will be, showing some interesting characters. We still need to see what our protagonist's future will hold now that his main reason to live, Askeladd, is now dead. Maybe he will finally try to follow the path that his father took by going to Iceland and then to that fantastical land called Vinland. Maybe. We'll find out soon.